Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us today. I'm Patricia Capella, the Conference Manager for Clarion Events Food and Beverage Group. Very excited to have Dale Willerton with us today. For those who were lucky enough to have joined us a few weeks ago, Dale will be going over rent assistance and leasing. He will be providing an update. Couple of things before we get to our Q&A session that I'm going to do with Dale. The presentation is on mute. I just wanted to let everyone know all audience members are in listen-only mode, which means you are muted. We will be monitoring audience engagement on the dashboard, and we do encourage you to participate by using the question pane. There will be time for question and answers at the end of the session, and this webinar, as well as others in our series, will be made available on our website in the coming week. So, Dale, thanks again for joining us. Can you give everyone a little bit about who you are?
I sure will, Patricia. I've been looking forward to this webinar all day, and this is a follow-up, sort of an update on the one we did about a month ago. So if you're getting leasing advice, if these are restaurant tenants, food service operators on this webinar, if you're getting leasing advice, make sure you understand who you're getting it from. You know, there's a lot of people spouting stuff out there. And I've been in commercial real estate for 30 years. So prior to 1993, I used to be a shopping mall manager. I was a leasing rep. I used to work for landlords. I was like an insider. And I realized it was the tenants that needed help. So I switched to the tenant side. And this is our 27th year in business as the Lease Coach. We've opened up 8 offices in North America. I've done about 1,500 projects myself. We have other coaches and consultants on our team. The Lease Coach concept is based on work for the tenant, get paid by the tenant, don't get in bed with the landlord. Don't get paid by the landlord. We have one master, and that is the tenant. And what you're seeing on your screen is my 3rd book, Negotiating Commercial Leases and Renewals for Dummies. So let's go to the next slide, and we're going to get ready to get into a number of questions coming up here right away. So Amy, there we go. All right. Oh, and a lot of our clients are independent operators, but a lot of them are probably about 50% are in the franchise industry. And franchise tenants are getting hit just as hard as independent restaurant tenants right now. So let's advance to the next slide and get right to our first question.
Yes, Dale, so we'll get started. What percentage of commercial landlords are providing their restaurant tenants with rent assistance during the pandemic?
Patricia, this is the way it breaks down, because this is all I'm eating, sleeping, and breathing right now is pandemic rent assistance for tenants. 50% of landlords that we're approaching on behalf of tenants are cooperative. They have a plan. We're not the first ones to call them, okay? So 50% are being quite cooperative. Approximately 40% are being more difficult. They're requesting more information. We're having to, do a lot of follow-up calls and follow-up emails and provide information. And about 10% of the tenants have decided, Patricia, to keep paying their rent. So 1 out of 10 tenants, even though they're being negatively affected by the pandemic, just don't want to get into any kind of negotiation or confrontation. So, at least half of them are being cooperative.
So, Dale, how should tenants approach their landlords, and what might the landlord ask of the tenant?
When I contact a landlord, I don't tell the landlord what I want. I don't start by saying, can I have this, or can the tenant forego the rent? I start by saying to them, and it's usually the property manager who I'm talking to, I'll start by saying, does the landlord have a rent assistance plan or program for its tenants? Okay, does the landlord have a plan or a program for its tenants? I want you to understand that this is like, the property that the tenant is in is like a boat. And all the tenants are like the passengers on the boat, and the captain is the landlord, right? So the captain should be the one that has the plan. And you want to start there, because if they say, well, yes, we're deferring rent, or we're abating rent, or we're doing this, I'll send you this to you, then we've got a platform from which to start. Now, just to follow up on that question though, landlords are asking tenants for financials, profit and loss statements. They're asking for comparables over last year. Some restaurants are still a little bit open and some are closed. They may want to know that you've already applied for your government assistance and things like that. So the more sophisticated landlords are expecting the tenant to come forward with some of their own paperwork like that.
Great. And I actually, I skipped over our second question, which this also is a part of, what are the best arguments that restaurant tenants can make to the landlord?
When I'm communicating with a property manager or a landlord, I make it, crystal clear that it's in the landlord's self-interest to help the tenants. Landlords know this, but it has to be said. It has to be said out loud. It has to be said by email. I'll say to the landlord, this tenant's been in this location for 12 years. According to the tenant, they've been pretty much a model tenant. They've paid their rent basically on time. You know them, they know you. You're happy with their restaurant. So really, where are you going to find a good replacement, reliable tenant like this? It's just in your self-interest, Mr. Landlord, to help the tenant get through this pandemic, get through the recession, so that 2021 will be back to normal. And I remind the landlord how expensive it is to replace a tenant. By the time the space sits vacant, because remember, nobody wants the space back. So I said, how many leasing calls have you gotten in the past 6 weeks? None, of course. Nobody wants the space. So when the dust all settles from this pandemic, it's going to come down to, how long was the space vacant? How much commission did the landlord have to pay? How much incentives and inducements did the landlord have to give the tenant to attract a new tenant? The landlord is so far better off keeping their existing tenant. It's just that plain.
Right. But what if the landlord repeatedly says no to a tenant's request for help?
We do hear that. And some landlords, it's important to understand the main reason a landlord will say no, they don't want to help the tenant, is not because they don't want to help the tenant. It's because the landlord is going to say 9 out of 10 no's. The landlord says, look, I'm the landlord. I've got my own mortgage. I've got my own problems. You need to pay your rent so I can pay my mortgage. But that's not the same argument. That's not a comparable argument. And I'll explain why. Restaurant tenants rely on customers. They rely on so many factors for these customers to come in to their restaurant. The landlord only has to deal with the bank or the mortgage holder. So the landlord can easily go back to the mortgage holder and say, I just want to pay interest on my mortgage for a few months, or can you just add this on? And the mortgage holder will do that. The mortgage holder does not want the property back. Right? So they're going to work with the landlord. Most of these landlords are getting assistance from their mortgage holder. They're just not telling the tenant that.
Great. Thank you, Dale. Can we advance to the next slide? Thank you about that. If a landlord offers the rent assistance for 2 months, is that even enough time?
It's really not. In fact, some landlords are only offering rent assistance for 1 month. They want you to come back, month after month after month. 2 months is not enough. Most of the rent assistance package deals that I'm negotiating right now for restaurant tenants, we're doing 9-month deals. We're taking them right to the end of 2020. And that's because even though nobody has a crystal ball, there's a pretty good expectation. What's going to happen is some of the restaurants are going to reopen. Okay, it's going to be a gradual, slow reopening, and not all their customers are going to come back. And then in the fall, Dr. Fauci, standing right beside, President Trump, is saying there's going to be a second wave in the fall, and these restaurants could end up closing again in August or September. So really, we want a 9-month package, which could be a combination of abatement at the beginning, abated rent that doesn't have to be paid back, then some rent assistance where the tenant's paying some rent and some of it's being deferred, taking you right through to 2020, because there's not going to be a quick cure here. Next slide.
Right. And that leads into the next question. If a tenant's lease is expiring in the next 18 months or so, how does this entire situation play out with their renewal negotiations?
This is the silver lining. My typical meat and potatoes project is negotiating a lease renewal rent reduction for a tenant. That's what I do with most of my day. And so many tenants come to us for that help. Right now, if you look 2 months ago before the pandemic, 3 months ago, the market rents were here. By the time we get through this pandemic and by the time we get through the recession, market rents are going to be down here. So if your lease is expiring in the next 18 months or so, and you want to stay open for business, this is actually a very good time to negotiate your lease renewal as well and to have those discussions. You should be getting, if your lease is negotiated properly, your rent should be going down for your renewal term. And, landlords aren't going to just give you that. They're going to make you work for it. Tenants have this misunderstanding that the landlord will charge you what the space is worth. No, the landlord will charge you as much as they can get. It's a capitalist society. Why shouldn't they charge you as much as they can get? You just have to be savvy enough to negotiate it and recognize that rents are going down. So if your rent is coming up, if your lease is coming up for renewal, you're in a good situation.
Right. So when you, the lease coach, when you negotiate a lease renewal for a tenant, what are you trying to get for that tenant? How much can the lease coach save?
Well, I'm only satisfied if we can save the tenant between 5 and 10 times our fee. It's really important. I didn't become the lease coach so a tenant could pay me $1 and I save them $1. I really want this to be a valuable transaction for the tenant. And I'll answer the first part of that question by referencing a conversation I had with one of our previous clients. I phoned him up. I wasn't even the consultant that did his project. And I said, what did we do for you? What did the lease coach do? And I knew, but I wanted to know if he knew. And he said, well, Dale, the first thing the lease coach did for me was they got me a rent reduction on my lease renewal. He said, I was thrilled. You saved me lots of money. But secondly, you got my deposit back. He said, I'd been in this location for 15 years and they wouldn't give my deposit back until you stepped in. Then the lease coach made my personal guarantee go away. Okay, and I don't really believe a personal guarantee should be forever and ever. So we negotiate very hard to remove existing personal guarantees. Because he had been in this location for 15 years, his store was ready for a remodel. And I said, what about the remodel? He said, well, yes, you negotiated to get some tenant allowance for me so I could remodel my store. He said, most of these things I would never have negotiated. He had the mindset, Patricia, that a lease renewal negotiation was just about the rent, but it's not. We approach a lease renewal negotiation as if this was a brand new tenant going into a brand new space. In other words, what inducement package would the landlord have to give a new tenant to attract them into a space? Well, that's the same inducement package we negotiate for on a lease renewal. It's a mindset. It's a mindset. And it's not easy and it's not fast, but it takes some experience to do that well.
Yeah, so different states are facing, there's some restaurants that are being allowed to reopen soon in states. So are all states facing the same landlord challenges, or are there differences?
They pretty much are. All restaurants in all states are facing the same challenges. We've got hundreds of restaurant clients. Some have closed like in March. Some are still open with their drive-throughs and they're doing not bad, But yes, every restaurant's going to go through the same challenge, just at a different time. But we all watch the same national newscast. So when you hear all the bad things happening in New York, well, that doesn't mean that's happening in every other state at that time. Different states are peaking at different times. So they are facing the same challenges. And as they begin to reopen slowly, my expectation is these restaurants are going to launch with very soft reopenings. And my wife and I, we probably dine out we used to dine out 3 or 4 times a week. And she's saying, well, just because the restaurants reopen, I'm not going to be the first one in line. I'm not going to, go there. Some of these restaurants are only allowed to open with 50% of their tables or 25% of their tables. Well, a restaurant can't survive with only 50% of their tables. They're paying rent on 100% of their space. So my prediction is, unfortunately, and I don't mean to sound doomsday, but my prediction is it's going to be a really, really slow reopening, and we're going to end up going back to these same landlords to get rent assistance even after the restaurant's doors have reopened, because it's going to be that slow.
Thank you, Dale. And actually, before we go to this next question, there's a question that came in from the audience that goes nicely with what we're discussing right now. By rent assistance, what do you mean? Rent payment delay, discount, forgiveness? My landlord is only giving me deferrals.
Right. I believe that if your restaurant is closed right now, you should be getting a 100% abatement, which is a forgiveness of your rent. So many tenants, they'll call me up and they'll say, I've been talking to my landlord and I think we've agreed to something. And I'll say, well, do you have it in writing yet? And they say, no. I said, well, call me back when you get it in writing, because so often the tenant doesn't understand the difference. The deferral means you're going to have to pay it back. An abatement means it's being forgiven. So rent assistance, though, is all of those things. I mean, sometimes a deferral is better than nothing, right? Here's the key. Too many landlords are expecting deferred rent to be paid back immediately. Like with starting 3 or 4 or 5 months from now, they want you to start paying back the money you couldn't pay today. You're not going to have the cash flow to do that. So if I'm getting a partial rent abatement, rent deferral package for a tenant, I want the deferral to go to the back end of the lease. If the lease doesn't expire for 3 years, I want it to go to the end of 3 years with no interest, and we'll deal with it then on the renewal. You still owe it, right? You still owe it, but at least you don't, there's no ridiculous expectations you're going to start paying it back in 3 months, because you're not going to be able to.
Right. And that actually goes nicely into our following question, which, you know, for those who are behind in the rent and, you know, if the landlord has sent them a default notice, should tenants be concerned that they're going to change their locks or evict them?
Well, Patricia, when I used to be a shopping mall manager, when I used to work for landlords, and I was, as a property manager, my number one job was rent collection. Everything else was under that. Collect the rent first. That was my number one job. I was in charge of sending out default notices to tenants who had not paid their rent. And first of all, the landlord, we never sent it out with malice or bad intent. It was more of a paper play on the board where we're going to put you in notice. Rarely did we ever evict a tenant. Rarely did we change their locks. We didn't want their space back, and no landlord wants your space back right now. But they want to leverage themselves. They want to see. Restaurant tenants are wonderful people, but I wouldn't let them negotiate my lease. So imagine if the default notice, and I'll back up so you can see this. Imagine the default notice is the landlord, you know, he's holding a rifle to you and he's saying, pay your rent. And then the default notice is when he cocks the trigger. Click, you hear that. A certain percentage of tenants, as soon as they hear the gun cock and get their default notice, they'll pay their rent. So scare tactics do work in this industry, but you know, the fact is half of these tenants can't afford to pay their rent. They're in default. They don't want to be in default. There's a big difference when you're talking to your landlord between I won't pay my rent and I can't pay my rent. You have to make that distinction. But no, I don't. I've seen a fair number of default notices going out. I've never seen anybody get closed yet regarding the pandemic.
Right. And as you said before, you know, I mean, they have no one else coming in to take this space. So,
that's right. They couldn't give it away.
Right. So, you know, for those that were planning to list their restaurant for sale before, you know, the pandemic happened, you know, how long do you think it will be before the economy normalizes so they can try to sell their restaurant?
I think it'll be 2021 before we start seeing many restaurants. We'll see plenty listed for sale, but they just won't sell. In 2021, things will start getting back to normal. Keep in mind, the number one reason someone will not buy your restaurant is because they think your rent is too high. So if you just go with the flow and you say, okay, my lease is coming up for renewal, as long as he doesn't raise my rent, I'll be happy. You know, that may prohibit you from finding a good buyer. Negotiating the lowest rent possible is not only good for your day-to-day cash flow, but it adds value to the business. So it's going to be a while for sure.
And actually, a question from the attendees, which fits nicely here. Would you recommend walking away from leases since the economy, you know, will not return as it was before?
Several of my clients already have. Here's a perfect scenario. A tenant will say to me, you know, we were forced to close our doors in March. So the landlord sees everybody's doors are closed. We've papered our window. We've taken out all of our restaurant equipment out the back door. And the landlord doesn't even know that we've permanently closed. They're not going to know until the ban is lifted and all the stores start opening, but who doesn't reopen? Okay, the tenants are literally papering their windows so the landlord can't see that they've removed their chattels and their equipment and they moved out. So it's not a matter of recommending it. I think that, you know, a typical landlord, even a good landlord, will walk a tenant right up to the cliff Okay, they don't want you to fall off the cliff, but they want to collect rent right to that point. So sometimes when my client says, Dale, if the landlord won't help me, I will close my restaurant. I'm not fooling anymore. Now the landlord will be serious about helping that tenant. See, if you're fighting too hard to keep your restaurant open, the landlord may not help you much. He may say, well, borrow the money from your brother, borrow the money from a family member. Why should I help you? Right? It's not into when I'm negotiating, and I want to add this in because it's important. When I'm negotiating a lease deal for a restaurant tenant, oftentimes we don't get the best deal while we're sitting at the negotiating table. We get the best deal when they see our bum walking out the door and they're losing the deal. Okay. So you see, there's a time to negotiate and there's a time to walk away and see if they come chasing you. So, and you know if you're a good tenant, you know if you've been faithful and paid your rent, and you know if there's a lineup of other tenants that want to be in that property, and most of the time there isn't. So there's only a few trophy locations out there. Most of these are pretty regular restaurant locations, pretty regular properties.
Yeah. So looking at our next slide here, if a restaurant tenant, wants to get some professional help dealing with their landlord, what are the options? Who can they turn to?
Well, Amy, I'll get you to advance to the next slide. We put a couple of things up here for people to see. Quite often, restaurant owners will turn to family members and friends, but they're usually only about 10% smarter than you. So that's really, kind of a poor choice. Real estate agents and brokers are typically trying to find tenants, introduce them to landlords, do a deal, and collect a commission. So not really a real estate agent isn't going to help you get a rent reduction. Landlords don't like that. The next choice on your list might be an attorney. Several tenants that I'm aware of have lawyered up. And we're still waiting to see if there's going to be much result there, because if you're in a legal dispute with your landlord, then you may need an attorney to defend you. But a lot of tenants consider an attorney to be the wrong tool in the toolbox. You're not suing your landlord. This is more of a negotiation. These lease agreements are not filled with loopholes. So many restaurant tenants have said, I can't pay my rent, my restaurant's closed, so I sent my lease to my attorney to review. Well, a couple $1,000s later, the attorney comes back and says, no, there's no loopholes. Well, I could have told you, professional landlords don't send out lease agreements with loopholes. We're not winning this on loopholes, okay? Of course, tenants can always turn to lease consultants like my company, the Lease Coach, and this is what we've been doing for the past 27 years. We only work for, show the slides coming up, we only work for the tenant, we only get paid by the tenant. So unlike a real estate agent, we're not chasing a commission. And Amy, you can just advance to the next couple of slides and we'll, I think the viewers can see what's there. Lots of great testimonials coming up on your screen. This tenant, saved me $30,000 per year. And on top of that, Dale's a nice guy. This individual has 7 locations. He's a great restaurant operator, but facing off with his landlord just wasn't his cup of tea. We're not all good at everything. There's 1,000 things I'm not very good at, but this is something I can really make a difference at. So take us to the next slide. It's my prediction that the really fancy restaurants, the higher end restaurants like these Brazilian steakhouses, are going to have the slowest recovery. I think the quick service restaurants, the ones where you can still go in and order and you're not having as much interaction with other people, they're going to recover faster, right? Look at this Pampa Brazilian steakhouse at the bottom. We just hired the Lease Coach for 4 more locations. Well, that was before the pandemic, but they're having a nice growth spurt and they're doing very well for themselves. But they get, it's a pretty high-end dining experience when you go to one of these places, and they're going to be a little bit slower to recover, like the Ruth Chris and Del Frisco's and ones like that. Take us to the next slide, Amy.
Yes, if a restaurant tenant wants to discuss their rent situation or talk about an upcoming lease renewal, what's the charge for the initial consultation?
Well, I'm doing about 3 per day, 3 restaurant tenant consultations per day. There is no charge to talk to me. We'll talk for 20 or 30 minutes about your situation, and I'll make sure you get sent a complimentary copy of my 330-page For Dummies book when you reach out as well. So on the next slide, you're going to be able to see some of the services we provide. And the very top one, is the pandemic rent assistance deferrals and abatements that we negotiate, but lease renewal, rent reductions, and all kinds of things we do for tenants. Call us first if this is any of these things need to be done, and we'll talk you through it. No charge to talk.
Great.
All right.
I know this is just an overview of your packages.
Yeah, when I speak at the the New York, California, and Florida restaurant shows, which are just fantastic events. We did the New York one 6 or 7 weeks ago, and that was exciting, right? I have a full rate sheet of my services. If you email me, I'll email you back the rate sheet. But it breaks down to this: if you want package number one, if you want me to coach you through the process, you can hire us to coach you, review your documents, and you pay over a 6-month period. Package number two is where I take charge and I do the negotiating for you. So this is a really important distinction to make. People say knowledge is power. Well, if knowledge was power, all you would have to do is read this book. You have a choice. You can read this book or you can hire the guy that wrote this book. The results are going to be different. And package number 3 is our site selection package, where if you're opening up a new location, I've gone as far as Hawaii to do site selection for clients. But package 1, I'm coaching you as you negotiate. Package 2, I take charge and I do the negotiating for you. And package 3 is site selection, where I come right to your city. In red, what you see there is our rent assistance package. This is new. This is a $1,500 package that lasts 45 to 60 days. It's a special project where we will take your landlord and your property manager head on right now, and we will help you get that rent assistance that you need for the short term. And of course, we do a fantastic lease document review for tenants who need that. But right now, the phone is ringing off the hook with the rent assistance packages, and a lot of them that are, Patricia, that are in their lease renewal stage are actually going for package 2. And if you go for package 2 and hire me to negotiate your lease renewal, I'll do your rent assistance now at no charge, because it's one big, long conversation with the landlord. Part of the reason that we're successful is that we understand there are many, many rounds and levels to these negotiations. The average tenant just wants to get it over with. This is not fun. They want to run their restaurant. They've got employees to deal with. This is a nuisance for the tenant, right? But for me, it could be 7, 8, 9, 10 rounds of negotiation with the landlord, but that's how we earn our fee. Okay, so take us to the next slide, and I've done a special coaching cash offer for any webinar attendees. So when you reach out to me today, if you want to book a free consult, you want a complimentary copy of my book mailed to you, you can get this coaching cash until the end of June. $250, $500, and $750 off of the individual projects. And I know some of these people are going to be listening to this and they're not necessarily watching it. So the project packages were $34.95, $64.95, and $95.95. So these are the amounts coming off. And at the bottom, Amy, if you'll advance those slides, when you hire the lease coach, you do not have to pay up front. You make 6 monthly payments as the work is done on package 1, 2, and 3. If you're facing a lease renewal, we will work on multiple locations. I want to emphasize this. If this is worth taking a minute to explain. The reason, Patricia, that so many tenants do such a bad job of negotiating a lease renewal is that they only negotiate with their existing landlord. What we do is we want some decoy locations. Our average client doesn't want to move. But if we don't create competition for their tenancy, if we don't produce some decoy locations trying to take that tenant away, remember, the landlord isn't going to give you a rent reduction out of the goodness of their heart. They're going to give you a rent reduction because they're afraid of losing you. And my job is to make them, is to create that fear and to show them, hey, this property over here we could move to, this property over here. So we'll work on multiple locations to get them the best possible renewal deal. And of course, there's no time limit on the projects. They're open-ended and time-wise, and we take no remuneration, no payment from the landlord. So that's on package 1, 2, and 3. So in a nutshell, that's it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Amy, if you want to forward to our next slide, we're going to go to a live Q&A. We have some sessions coming in, but before we do that, if we can just go to the next slide. I just wanted to remind everyone that, Clarion Events Food and Beverage Portfolio, we have been pumping out several webinars during this time, and you can find them all located at the foodandbevshows.com, our resource page. Dale's webinar will be posted on this resource page after this, and everyone will also get a copy of this via email too. And Dale, I know we'll probably be working together again, hopefully the next couple of months, providing another update. But before, and Amy, can we go back to the Q&A session slide so we can leave Dale's contact information up while we go to questions? Thank you very much. Okay, so our first question that just came in, should a restaurant reopen when the stay-in-place order is lifted if he does not have a favorable deal in place?
I would be very, if I'm understanding the question, I would not reopen my restaurant if it was breaking any laws. I would not do that. You'd find your landlord would turn on you pretty quickly. Is that the way you're reading that, Patricia?
No, sorry. When the stay-in-place order is lifted, should a restaurant reopen provided that they don't have a favorable deal in place?
Absolutely. Just because you don't have the best rent deal, you still have that lease agreement looming over your head. You still signed that lease agreement years ago. And so there is an agreement in place already. The fact that you couldn't negotiate a better one, definitely I'd get my doors open and I would get creative. If the landlord senses you're going to be a little bit lazy or you're going to be a little bit hard to work with, that you're not going to make your best efforts, they may not help you that much. Landlords really do love to see the restaurant tenants making a lot of effort to do delivery and do drive-through and do pick up, and if you're doing that, you probably will get a little bit more consideration from the landlord.
Thank you. Our next question here, what about one-sided lease terms that protect the LL but not the T?
To protect the landlord but not the tenant. Oh, well, a formal lease agreement ranges from, on the light side, maybe 30 pages, on the heavy side up to 70 pages. That lease agreement was prepared by the landlord to protect them. So no lease agreement, no lease negotiator, no attorney is going to get you a situation where the lease agreement is perfectly fair for both parties. It's always going to lean in the landlord's favor. That's just the nature of the beast. So there's no getting around that. But the truth is, if the tenant pays their rent on time and runs a proper business, in most cases, they'll get a fair shake from the landlord. It's just, the restaurant industry is such a tough industry to make a good living in, and it's so challenging. You want to put out a great product, and you want to have great employees. It's so I used to own 2 restaurants, Patricia. I didn't want to work that hard.
The next questions we have here are in regards to financials. I'm going to read both of them because they kind of play off of each other. The first, should we provide our financials in government PPPs? And if the tenants are being asked for financials, what assistance they are getting? Can a tenant ask a landlord what programs they are leveraging and to what extent? And I can repeat that if you need.
No, the answer is yes to everything. Here's kind of the key. If the landlord's asking you for your financials, try not to send those into the abyss. In other words, well, I'm prepared to give you these financials if you tell me what you're going to do with them. What are you going to do? Because I'll say to the property manager, are you going to send us a document? Are you going to send us a lease amending document? Because once this is agreed to, once this is all emailed out and it is talked about verbally, it has to be put into a lease amending document. So they may be trying to look at your financials so that they can come back and say, well, you're pretty healthy. You got money in the bank. I had a talk with a restaurant tenant a couple of days ago, and he said, truth is, I've got enough money in the bank to pay my rent for the next year if I have no income. He was reasonably well off, right? So you've got to be careful what you show them if you don't know what the pretense is and why they want to see it. And definitely ask the property manager about what the landlord is doing for help. Keep in mind, property managers, the larger landlords don't always tell their local in the trenches property managers what's going on, okay? In my book, I talk about 5 different types of landlords. Some of these landlords are mom and poppers. I mean, they don't have a clue what's going on. Others are very sophisticated landlords, and they've got teams of people helping them, and they're going to come out and be just fine. So you have to know who you're negotiating against.
And actually, that's a question. What happens when you have someone else who is in the same leasing space is maybe being told something different from their landlord versus the other person? For example, one person was allowed to have a deferral where the other was being demanded to pay. But the two leasing people have spoken to each other, so they're aware of the other situation. How do you handle that with your landlord and approach that?
Well, this is very common, and the landlord is not morally or ethically or legally obligated to treat all tenants the same. And a national tenant that has like 400 locations might get treated differently than a franchise tenant or than an independent tenant. So you should almost expect that someone else in your building is getting a better deal than you, but someone else is probably getting a worse deal than you. It really comes down, see, here's what happens in reality. When a tenant is negotiating with the landlord, they get to a point that the tenant is now comfortable. Okay, I'll do that deal, right? And they stop negotiating. If they hadn't stopped, they maybe could have gotten a lot more. But everybody stops at a different place. Everybody stops negotiating in a different place. So the deals are different. And one thing that I would say, though, is when I'm talking to a team member, I've been doing this for 27 years for tenants, and a tenant will call me up and say, my next door neighbor, Bob, he says he's not paying any CAM. He doesn't have to do this. He doesn't have to do that. And I said, give me Bob's number. And I phone up Bob and I say, Bob, now I just have to know this. And of course, Bob was bullshitting the guy and didn't know what his lease said. So there's so much misinformation out there. Just because someone tells you something, don't swallow it hook, line, and sinker.
Got it. Good advice. What can you suggest about apartment leasing and negotiating rental assistance? Working at a theme park and haven't worked in 1 month and a half.
For residential apartments.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm the commercial lease guy. Here, residential apartments, I think you're dealing with a different type of investment. Okay, like for example, I own real estate as an investment. I would never own commercial real estate because it's too volatile. I own residential real estate because if one tenant moves out, it's easy to find another family that will move in. Right. So I think there's a whole different strategy here. And if you're not working, you probably can't pay your rent. And that's just what you have to say. So I'm not giving a very good answer here, but it's residential is not where I shine.
No, that's okay. Thank you, though, for answering that. We have a question about San Francisco. How familiar are you with the San Francisco rental market?
Been there, love it, very expensive. Easy to make mistakes in San Francisco Bay Area. We have an office in Los Angeles, so it's not far to go when I need to go there. Okay,
perfect. Let me see here. I'm not sure if this question got a little choppy. What is their incentive to negotiate if you are paying them?
None. And a really smart question. If you can't afford to pay the rent, then you don't, right? You have no money to give them. If you choose to withhold some of the rent, or if you don't pay the rent, then the whole dynamic changes, and it'll come full circle back to you at that time. So sometimes you just have to decide, no, I'm not going to pay the rent, and communicate that to the landlord and see where it goes.
And the last question we have here is, what's success in renegotiating a totally new lease?
The goal, the goal is rarely to have a whole new lease agreement. It's all about the terms. These are all spokes on the wheel. So it all comes down to a half a dozen clauses that are hurting you. Okay. When I do an offer to lease on behalf of a tenant, we've got 21 business points. And then when we do the formal lease agreement, there's several hundred talking points. Most of them are non-financial. 50% of my job is to negotiate the financial aspects of the lease, and 50% of my job is to negotiate the non-financial lease assignment rights and things like that. Hours of operation and signage and parking and all of those things. So, the goal shouldn't be to have usually the goal is not to have a whole new lease agreement, it's just to have better terms.
Thanks, Dale. And actually, if you want to share a little bit about your book, we have a question that came in. Does your book walk you through what we need to say to a landlord if we want to start this conversation before hiring someone?
Well, this is my third book on this subject. It is available in Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You can order it on our website as well. This was written several years ago. Okay, so there's nothing in here dealing with the pandemic per se. Okay, a little bit on force majeure, but that's not where this is all going. So no, and let me explain. Part of the reason people love the For Dummies book, and my publisher has explained that the average person who buys a For Dummies book only reads 30 or 40% of it, and it's all written very sectionally. So if you've got a question about deposits or personal guarantees or parking or signage, you can go right to that section of the book in 5 or 10 minutes. You can read it and you've got all the answers, right? This is not a start at the beginning and read to the back book. It's not a step-by-step book. It's written to be. Here's what I want to put in perspective. Every year, there's probably 100,000 restaurants that open, but in America every year 2 million leases come up for renewal. Okay, and that's the thing here. So this book was written somewhat to the first-time tenant, but it was written partially to the existing tenants who did a horrible job on their first lease and they're facing a lease renewal and they want to know how to do better. They want to know what the arguments are for the things, because it's if after this webinar we went out to the parking lot and I said, "Oh, Patricia, look, your car has a flat tire," you're going to say, well, thanks for pointing that out, Dale. What you really wanted to know is who will come and fix your flat tire, what will it cost, how fast can they do it, and that's what you're going to find inside the book. Okay, when I go through a formal lease agreement, it's really easy to pick out the nasty clauses. But if you don't know the arguments or the step down clauses to negotiate for, you just got a flat tire.
Right. No, I love that, because it's basically you have your question, you find the section, and then you have your answer. So the next question we have here, we have a couple more. What if we have a restaurant in a shopping mall? Do we have to open when they open, or is there a different conversation with the landlord?
Well, yes. As a former shopping mall manager, I used to. We had 85 tenants in the mall. We had a big food court. We had restaurants on the perimeter of the property, and tenants were entering and shopping from the inside out. So, if the mall is closed, the mall is closed. But once it opens, you're going to have to get back in there and get your doors open. It's going to be pretty slow. You'll be able to work with a lot less staff. But most lease agreements, Patricia, have what's called a continuous occupancy clause. And that means that when the mall is open, you have to be open. And if you're not, then you're in a default position. Plus, it also says to the landlord, well, look, you're not really trying. You're not getting in there. Your doors aren't even open. You've got to make an effort. What I'm seeing is that I think there's going to be reduced hours. Like, for example, I had to pick up some supplies the other day from a Staples. Okay. Well, they were only open from noon till 5. So I think we're going to see some of these malls open up with reduced hours, and department stores and that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I know our Starbucks down the street is 7 to 2:30. So the next question here, this is actually very interesting. My landlord has not asked for rent since the pandemic. I've requested to have a full conversation about going forward, but have not had a response.
And that's interesting. I'm aware of situations like that, but there's going to come a day of reckoning. So this tenant, the person asking this question, has done the right thing. Make sure though that you've put it in writing. Okay, like I really do think you want to be proactive, not reactive. And sometimes if they didn't get your message, if it was just kind of casual, these emails are really important. And when I send an email to someone and they don't respond the first time, I forward the same email to them and I say, would you please acknowledge that you received this email? I'm not asking them to agree with me. Would you acknowledge that you received it? Because I want to memorialize that I've come to you with this. But that type of landlord is probably going to be pretty reasonable when the time comes. So I don't know why they wouldn't be responding to you now, but I keep going back to them. Once isn't, remember, you have one landlord. The landlord might have 100 tenants. The landlord maybe confused you with some other tenant and doesn't even realize it was you.
Interesting. Our next question here. Are the landlords filing for economic injury, is that EIDL? My landlord is elderly, owns the building where we are located, and lives off his 2 investment properties. He claims if we cannot pay, it will cause him financial problems too. Is there no help for landlords which will lessen the pressure for their tenants?
I think the only real help for landlords is through their commercial lenders, through their mortgage holders. But those mortgage holders are being cooperative. The banks and the lenders, they don't want these commercial properties. There'll be a glut of them on the market. They don't want them. So I think landlords are getting a lot of help if they go to their bank, but they're not necessarily telling the tenant that. They don't want the tenant to think, like it's easy for the landlord to say, well, I have to pay my mortgage, so you have to pay your rent, because that kind of sounds fair, but it's not comparable because you're in the restaurant business and he's in the real estate business.
Right. And I have a last question here, and then I believe that is it for the day. Is this also a good opportunity or time, if you have your current restaurant but looking to downsize, how would you approach that in a lease perspective?
Well, let's use this example. Let's say 10 tenants in a year. 10 tenants come to me and say, Dale, my restaurant is the wrong size. 9 of them want and need to downsize. Only 1 of them wants to get bigger. So most of when you go to lease a space, often it's a predetermined amount of space, and you're taking it whether it's the right size or not. And so a lot of tenants have very, very profitable restaurants if they were smaller. They've bitten off more than they can chew, and we negotiate downsizing all the time, and it's not always bad for the landlord. If you're going from 6,000 square feet down to 4,000 square feet, that gives the landlord a nice little 2,000 square foot pocket for someone else. Here's the catch, Patricia. Most of these restaurants were never designed with that thought in mind. So everything spread out through the restaurant, and now it's a small fortune to downsize it, right? Because nobody ever thought, well, what if we ever wanted to give 2,000 square feet back? If you're only 300 or 400 square feet too big, it's going to be pretty hard to get the landlord to take that back, because where are they going to find a 300 or 400 square foot tenant? Okay, but downsizing. In the shopping mall industry, the landlord sees the most profitable tenants, not as the tenants who have the highest volume of sales, but the tenants who have the highest sales per square foot. Okay, it's sales per square foot that make you successful, not gross sales, because your expenses could be way out of whack. It's better to have a lineup of people out your door waiting to get in than to have 1/3 of your tables always unoccupied.
Great, thank you. And I think we'll end with this one last question. This is an opinion question. How long for a business to return back to pre-coronavirus economy, if at all, do you think?
I think it'll be 2021. Depending on, I've got restaurant clients that are in touristy areas. I've got restaurant clients that are, they do 60% of their business in the summer months, And then my restaurant clients who are in the enclosed shopping malls do a tremendous amount of business around November and December, right? So your location is going to somewhat determine that. But I think 2020 is a write-off. 2020 is going to be the year you're going to come back and say, I survived it. Nobody got ahead in 2020. You just survived it, and you were able to keep going in 2021. Remember, there's going to be a glut of restaurant space coming back on the market. So by the time the pandemic lifts and we come out of the recession, there's going to be lots of second-generation restaurant space to lease, and there's going to be many fewer restaurants. Landlords are going to have to treat you better next year than they're treating you this year.
Huh. Well, thank you, Dale, so much. That is all of our questions. It's always lovely to talk with you. I know I always learn a lot on this webinar. And yeah, unless you have any last things that you'd like to leave everybody with.
Well, take courage, everybody. You're in a really tough industry. We do really appreciate and love our restaurants, and you know, if you can make it out to one of these big Clarion restaurant shows, make sure you come to that, because there's so many great presenters and exhibitors. You can't afford to miss these big restaurant shows put on by Clarion, and I'll be there speaking, and you know, just come over and take a seminar. Come to my booth. Yep,
absolutely. Well, great. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe. Until next time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.